What if the greatest transfer of wealth in history didn't involve a single bank robbery? No vaults cracked open. No pirate ships ambushing treasure fleets. Just paperwork policies, trade agreements, and a quiet system of extraction so efficient that it built an empire. For centuries, the British Empire told the world it civilized the nations it conquered. Railways, education, law. But what if these symbols of progress were simply the packaging for the perfect economic machine? A machine designed not to develop India, but to drain it. Because somewhere between the 18th century and the mid-20th, India went from one of the richest civilizations on Earth, a global powerhouse of textiles, diamonds, spices, and knowledge, to one of the poorest. Money doesn't simply disappear. Wealth doesn't evaporate. It moves. And if India's wealth moved, where did it go? This is not a story of a typical economic collapse. It's the story of how a financial strategy, disguised as governance, funded the rise of global power while slowly suffocating one of the world's oldest economies. The textbooks call it colonial trade. Economists call it the drain of wealth. But history might better describe it as economic vampirism. Stay with this story, because once you see how wealth can be extracted without guns or banks, only rules, you might begin to recognize similar patterns today. The wealth paradox. Before the British arrived, India accounted for nearly a quarter of the world's GDP. A vibrant network of merchants, artisans, mathematicians, and farmers powered an economy built on skill, not exploitation. But empire doesn't like equality. Power is cheaper when the other side is weakened first. When the East India Company first set foot on Indian soil in 1600, it didn't come with armies. It came with ledgers. Merchants became governors. Governors became kings. And the company, a private corporation, became a sovereign power. How? Through the simplest mechanism in finance. Control the trade, control the money, control the nation. But trade wasn't enough. They needed monopoly. So the company began reshaping India's economy, not to grow it, but to redirect it. Textiles, once a world-renowned Indian craft, were taxed heavily. Indian weavers were forced to buy overpriced British cloth. And when they tried to resist, their looms were broken, their livelihoods erased. Every policy had one purpose: to make India dependent on British imports and pay for them using its own stolen wealth. Commerce became a cage, the revenue trap.
Is this the complete
Britain
revenue?
introduced
Yes,
a new
Hazur.
system.
Very well.
Taxes collected in cash instead of goods.
Next in line.
Farmers who never needed money before now had to sell their produce on British-controlled markets. Prices were manipulated. Debt soared. Land seizures followed. The peasant who once fed the empire now paid for the privilege of starvation. The land itself changed hands, from local communities to foreign administrators, turning Indian farmers into tenants on their own soil. And the money, not reinvested into India, not spent on the people. It was shipped out, a one-way pipeline to London. A financial drain disguised as governance, hidden in plain sight. By the mid-1800s, the British weren't just extracting wealth. They were making India pay for its own occupation. Indian taxes funded British soldiers in India. Indian resources, Right Arrow fed British factories. Indian revenues, Right Arrow paid British administrators' salaries. The colonized financed their colonizers. A self-sustaining empire. But here's the sinister genius. Because India never saw its wealth leave, no plundered gold paraded through the streets. The system seemed invisible. Legitimate. Normal. like a parasite so perfectly adapted that the host doesn't feel the drain until it's too weak to stand. And yet, this was just the beginning. Because soon, Britain discovered an even more efficient way to siphon India's fortune. A financial illusion involving shipping companies, trade surpluses, and ledger tricks that made stolen money look like fair payment. A trick that didn't just drain India's past wealth. It stole its future. Imagine a money loop so elegant that the victim thanks the thief. That was the brilliance of Britain's financial design in India. To understand it, we must look at a mechanism known quietly in archives and economic history books as the home charges. It sounds harmless, bureaucratic, but this one phrase explains how a civilization's wealth was shipped out, without a single crate marked loot. Hear how the system worked. 1. India exported goods, cotton, opium, indigo, tea, rice. 2. Britain sold those goods at massive profits abroad. 3. But India wasn't allowed to keep the earnings. Instead, London claimed that money as payment for the British Army stationed inside India. British administrative salaries and pensions paid in London. Interest on debt forced onto India by Britain. Purchases of British goods India was required to buy. India produced the wealth, but Britain claimed the profits. And when Indian taxpayers complained that funds were scarce for irrigation, schools, or famine relief, London responded, "There is no money in the budget." The truth: the money was in Britain's budget. The currency scheme, a silent extraction. If you control the currency, you control the economy. Britain understood this better than anyone. India's trade surplus, the wealth it generated, was paid out not to India, but in a separate London-based account controlled entirely by the British Treasury. So if an Indian merchant wanted British goods, he couldn't use Indian earnings abroad. He had to convert it into rupees by paying fees to Britain. Profits created by Indians, collected by Britain, right arrow, bought back by Indians, right arrow, taxed again by Britain. A closed loop of value extraction. Money that should have built India built the Industrial Revolution instead. Manchester's cotton industry didn't rise from brilliance alone. It rose because Bengal's textile economy was broken first. Famine as economic policy. A healthy population resists exploitation. A starving one doesn't. During British rule, 35 to 40 million Indians died in famines, not because India lacked food, but because food became a commodity for export. Grain shipped abroad while villages starved. Prices raised beyond affordability. Relief withheld to prevent dependency. Indian rice, right arrow, fed Britain. Indian people fed the soil. The British governor during the Great Famine of 1876 insisted that market forces were more sacred than human life. Economics became a weapon. Hunger became the enforcement. And while India buried its dead, London's stock market thrived. The illusion of improvement. Britain loves to point to railways as proof of development. Let's look closer. Railways were not built to unite India. They were built to extract resources faster and ship them cheaper. Paid for by Indian taxes, loans issued by Britain, profits guaranteed to British investors. So even the interest on infrastructure flowed out of India. The tracks ran like veins, but the heart-pumping wealth was thousands of miles away. Schools taught Indians English, so they could serve British clerks. Courts enforced British law to protect British profit. Everything else, carefully underfunded, deliberately neglected. A global empire operating like a corporate takeover. A world power built on another's loss. By 1900, Britain owned half of the world's ships, 1/4 of all global territory, the most powerful military on Earth. How did an island nation with limited natural resources achieve this? With India as its financial engine. Economists estimate that the total wealth drained from India, adjusted for modern value, exceeds $45 trillion. Enough money to reshape global power for centuries. Empires aren't built on courage. They're built on accounts payable. The real crime. The tragedy wasn't just the wealth extracted, but the growth denied. For every school never built, for every railway line drawn only toward a port, for every industry crushed before it could rise, India lost not only its past prosperity, but the future it could have owned. Because money is more than currency. It is time, it is opportunity. It is the ability to choose. Under empire, India lost that choice. Yet this system wasn't merely economic. It wasn't simply bad policy. It was a philosophy that some nations exist to rule, and others to serve. A philosophy defended not with swords, but with numbers. We are nearing the core of the story. Because Britain didn't just take wealth. It rewrote the narrative, casting itself as savior, while India was told to be grateful for its own exploitation. In the final part, we reveal the paradox that still shapes the global economy today. How the same mechanisms of empire quietly survive in the modern world. For centuries, Britain convinced the world that it gave India progress. Railways, law, democracy. But when a nation is forced to finance its own chains, its liberation is not a gift, it is a debt paid in advance. And the final twist in this financial saga reveals something darker. India was made to believe it owed Britain, while Britain owed India everything. When the British finally began to loosen their grip in the 1940s, the debt ledger told an inconvenient story. India didn't just balance out the books, it had financed the global ambitions of the empire for generations. London feared that if this truth became widely accepted, the illusion of moral authority would collapse. So instead, the narrative was rewritten. Britain had developed India. India should be grateful. Empire was a gift. But history doesn't forget so easily. A hidden battlefield. Economic extraction is one form of power. Controlling the story about that extraction is another. If the world believes you brought civilization, not exploitation, your wealth looks earned. Thus the British Empire became a PR empire too. It framed resistance as rebellion, nationalism as chaos, freedom as a threat to stability. Because the colonizers' greatest fear is not the uprising of the oppressed, but the understanding of the oppressed. The understanding that wealth was not gifted, it was taken. What Britain truly built. This is the paradox that undercuts the heroic image of empire. Britain's golden age, its power, prestige, and industrial dominance, was not built on British wealth. It was built on Indian poverty. Every grand British museum displaying world heritage once belonged to someone else's world. Every brick of those Victorian monuments may as well be stamped, made in India. Some economists argue India could have been one of the richest nations today, if not for 2 centuries of extraction. Because the most valuable resource in a modern economy is not oil, not gold, but time unbroken, time to grow, time to innovate, time to invest in your own people. India's timeline was interrupted. An interruption is the most invisible crime in finance. You don't see what could have existed. You only see the damage left behind. The present, the empire never ended. Here is the haunting part. Even after the British left, the financial mechanisms remained. debt replacing direct taxation, foreign investment replacing imposed trade, global corporations replacing the East India Company, friendly development loans replacing home charges. Extraction became privatized. Outsourcing replaced occupation. Global finance replaced empire. Today, wealth still flows outward from the developing world. But the pipelines look like supply chains. The hand that takes no longer holds a flag. It holds a contract. The empire changed its costume, not its purpose. This is the lesson the British Raj left behind. Control money and you control nations. Control narratives and you control history. And if you control both, you build an empire that never truly collapses. Conclusion, a quiet realization. We tell ourselves that humanity advances through enlightenment. Better systems, better morals. But the global economy we participate in today was designed by those who mastered extraction. The blueprint wasn't erased when the empire fell. It was copied. India finally regained political independence, but financial independence. That remains an ongoing struggle, a rewriting of the future that was once stolen. Because wealth isn't just numbers in an account. It shapes identity, confidence, possibility. When a nation's wealth is drained, its voice is drained with it. And so the greatest act of resistance is simply to speak the truth aloud. The empire was not benevolent. It was profitable. The world we live in still carries the fingerprints of that profit. Empires do not disappear. They evolve. And history is their balance sheet.